Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are very welcome on the 7th meeting from the series Taming Joyce, Oswajanie Joyce'a, organized together by Irish Honorary Consulate in Poznań, English Department of Adam Mickiewicz University, and Irish Culture Foundation. And our tonight's guest is Irish historian Liz Gillis. Liz, hello and welcome.
Hello.
Formally right now. Thank you very much that you found time, because as we already mentioned, like on off, you are extremely busy with all your projects. And I think tonight's topic is very, very close to you, because we will discuss the situation of Irish women during the time when Ulysses was written and published, and we will touch all those interesting aspects of that. And I think the thing that is actually nicely linked with that is that Nuala O'Connor novel called Nora is this year Dublin One Book. So it's widely written all over the world, and there are clubs as well organized in Poland as well. Liliana, do you run club with your students?
Oh, yes. And I'm also reading Nora tomorrow in my master's class. Karolina Węsławska is with us. So, and she's writing her MA. This is one of the texts that she's using for her MA. So yes. Perfect. So this is what we're doing. Mm-hmm.
So you are very welcome already to Polish edition of the meeting with Nuala O'Connor, which will take place on 11th of April, so next Monday. All the details can be found on Irish Embassy in Warsaw Facebook profile, because the registration is through Eventbrite, so we can find link there. And I post today as well on Irish Culture Foundation profile some information about that. And let me introduce our speaker before we start. So Liz has a degree in modern Irish history and specialized in the Irish Revolutionary period. She's a lecturer at Chaplain College Dublin, researcher on the history show on RTE Radio. She also worked as a curator on the RTE 1916 Centenary Project, as a tour guide in Kilmainham, historical consultant on projects including the Custom House Visitor Center and Hyatt Central Liberties Hotel. Liz has been appointed as the South Dublin County Council Decade of Centuries historian in residence for 2021, so she's still very busy with that. And I want to show you the books that Liz wrote, so I will probably maybe share the profile, so you can, we have to in here. So you can see some of the Liz books. So it's Women of the Irish Revolution, the Hills Brothers and the Irish Revolution, Revolution in Dublin, which is Photographic History 1960-1923, and May 25th, Burning of the Custom House 1921. Liz was twice a guest of the conferences organized together with the History Department of Adam Mickiewicz University and Irish Culture Foundation. So I just want to remind those nice memories and nice pictures. And we have two publications after that conference, which was actually dedicated to the role of the Irish women. So the lectures was absolutely great. And Liz, some of you might hear before, is very passionate about getting people interested in history. She's working with schools, with young people, with local history societies, general public. So huge Irish, huge interest in Irish history. So I'm looking forward to this meeting. And I would probably pass over right now the leading of the meeting to my great partner at those meetings, Professor Liliana Sikorska. So Liliana, over to you with introduction and first question to our guest.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, of course, Nora is very much connected with what we're talking about, but we're going to talk about not only about Ulysses and the women in Ulysses, but let's start with something more general. Perhaps because, well, somebody wants to get in. Perhaps let's start with the position of women, which was undoubtedly changing at the beginning of the 20th century, but could you tell us a little bit more about it? For example, was there a suffragette movement? And I'm talking about it in connection also with something through which we can see, Nora, the novel, as well as all the works by Joyce, which is how can that be connected with the so-called New Woman fiction, or New Woman as a literary trope in a way. But let's start with the position of women at the beginning of the 20th century. Suffragettes, no suffragettes. What was going on, Liz? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thanks, Liliana. Yeah, so there was. So you had towards the end of the 19th century, you have the suffragists, who were those pioneers, and those women and men who were advocating the rights for women. However, it's led by a very middle and upper class element of society. And although they were fighting for the rights for women, as in voting rights and so on, it wasn't that they would win the vote for all women, just for a certain few. And it's like the belief is that, well, if some of us have the vote, then we can be your voice. We can be the voice of the everyday woman in Ireland. Now, the thing is, like, some of them were so ahead of their time. Anna Haslam and her husband Thomas are advocating birth control, a huge thing for women sort of advancing in this sort of aspect of life and becoming politicized was university, was access to third level education. So by the end of the 19th century, you do have young women who would be the next generation, the suffragettes, because there is a difference between suffragettes and suffragists. Women like Hannah She Skeffington, you have also Margaret Cousins, Meg Connery, and these women would not just be active in Ireland, but they would go beyond, as far as India in the 1920s. But they're inspired by that first generation. But whereas they did not think that it was, just enough to write letters to your politician like those pioneers, the suffragists, they believed in more militant action, but not as militant as the women in London, in England, and the suffragette movement over there. Now, they're, actually physically attacking people and property, but in Ireland, in Dublin, the Irish Women's Franchise League, set up by Hannah She Skeffington, her husband, Francis She Skeffington, is involved. They have a newspaper, the Irish Citizen, and you have, as those people, Meg Cousins, or Margaret Cousins, Meg Connery, and all of these women that are involved, but they believe that government property is legitimate, for a target for attack. And you see that in 1912, where all of these women in the IWFL go on this campaign attacking government property, be it post boxes, smashing windows in government buildings. And the reason for that is because the Home Rule Bill, which would give Ireland sort of a form of independence, but we'd still be part of the British Empire, like dual sort of monarchy, there was no place for women in Ireland if it got home rule. So women would not advance politically under this. And Hannah She Skeffington's father was a politician that voted against including women in this. So she is having this sort of, this national sort of fight. And then she's having this personal fight with her father, who does not believe in women getting the right to vote and so on. So you can imagine the turmoil there and what dinner must have been like for in that house. But where you have, there's a big difference between the Irish suffragette movement and the British suffragette movement, in that the English suffragette movement is tied in with Labour. And you have a lot of Irish women, including Eva Gore-Booth, so the sister of Constance Markievicz.
Yes.
She's very much involved in the trade union movement and the suffragette movement in England. She actually gets her sister Constance involved, politicised that way, and they set up their own sort of branch of the suffragettes in Sligo, where they're from. But in Ireland, you have the extra strand of nationalism, republicanism. So it's votes for women, it's women's rights, it is labor rights, and it is nationalism. It's personal freedom and national freedom. So what you find is that Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, although a pacifist, will support the Republican movement when that is advancing. Maud Gonne, who is an actress, she's the one that W.B. Yeats, he's the lover.
Yes,
like,
we know that.
Is,
Yeah. Okay.
But she set up her own political organisation in Nina Naharan in 1900. And that brings together women of all different classes in Dublin, from middle class to working class, women who have had access to third level education, so like that first generation, but also women who are going to study to become a secretary, women who are signing up to the Gaelic League classes to learn the Irish language. So you've got that professional education, but then you've got that personal education, because that cultural revolution is taking place. So women are becoming politicized from many different angles. And it's not the third level institutions as universities. You will not find many working class women in those institutions, but where you will find women like Nora and so on will be going into the secretarial college if they get a scholarship, if they're lucky, and very importantly, the Gaelic League.
Yes, well, you've mentioned one name that I wanted to ask you about, which is, of course, Constance Makiewicz. But let's go back to something else. You've also mentioned two things that I'm very much interested in, which is we have social classes, and of course the social classes, and now you say that the movement was kind of inclusive to women of different social classes, which is very interesting. But apart from that, we have to look at, we're talking about the beginning of the 20th century, but we have to look at generation. So, the generation of Lady Gregory versus the generation of Nora Joyce. That would be, an interesting comparison. Lady Gregory, old schooler, Misha, I'm sorry. So Lady Gregory, old school, but still, given to the Celtic twilight, the cultural movement. And then you have someone who comes from, and of course, gentry, aristocracy, that kind of a standing. And then you have someone like Nora Joyce, who is really, from a lower class. And then yet, and we talked a little bit about that in my class, that yet, she is not only leaving her place of origin, she is going to Dublin. She becomes quite independent because she begins working in that hotel. So there must have been something that happened in between the generation of Lady Gregory through these, all of these different women, but, we're basically talking about aristocratic women, to create the possibility of someone like Nora to study, well, not to study, but to work and to be independent. And I think that's the greatest idea. So I didn't really know that Eva Gorbuth was involved with the suffragette movement. But if you could tell us a little bit more about this, on the one hand, the makeup of Ireland at the beginning of the 20th century in terms of social classes, but also about the opportunities for women. What happened that enabled Nora to become what she became? Even if she didn't meet Joyce, she would still be, I think, an independent woman at some point. So there must have been some change that allowed for that. So if you could perhaps tell us a little bit more about that, if anything comes to your mind in that respect.
Yeah, I suppose a big thing as well is how important theatre is. Because especially in Dublin, like, Irish people love the theatre. And when you have the Abbey, the National Theatre, taken off, a lot of people go. So although the actors and, you know, the writers and so on are from those upper echelons, some of the actors are actually from working class backgrounds. And one example to give you, in the Abbey, you have Sean Connolly, who was killed in the Easter Rising, but his sister is with him at City Hall fighting, you know. So like Ireland's a very, very small place, and there's a lot of word of mouth. But when, again, and I've said this before in talks, we sort of downplay the importance of a Nina and a Heron in sort of showing young women what they could do, because we think of the women in the revolutionary movement and it's coming them on, but a Nina and a Heron was active for 14 years from 1900. A couple of things itself had changed in Ireland. So with Catholic emancipation, so up to 1829, you have Catholics not being, you know, we're you know, pretty much second-class citizens in the country. Once we win Catholic emancipation, practice our religion openly, but then you see opportunities happening for Catholics. They're starting to, you know, work their way up. So people that possibly were from the lower echelons begin to work their way up. And key to all of this is education. Education is freedom, education is power. And certainly with that generation of young women who then become the activists in 1920, and a lot of them from middle class, but a lot of them from, say, lower middle class, their fathers are managers in companies or foremen in companies. So they've got a little bit of money. They begin to realize, okay, train my daughter, you know, send her to, you know, be trained as a seamstress or to be a secretary or in, you know, a primary school teacher. So the parents are really realizing that education is freedom, education is power, and they're giving those opportunities to their daughters, not just the boys. Like the boys would follow in the family business or join the British Army or be a priest or whatever. But I was amazed by meeting the relatives of these women, how many of their fathers actually insisted the girls went and got some form of education. So that, you know yourself, you go to college and you're meeting people of like minds and you're sharing the ideas. And then with the likes of the newspaper written by the suffragettes, by Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, that was promoting radical ideas. You know, it's, and the amount of ordinary sort of working class people that read these newspapers. Then Inina had its own newspaper, Ban na Héireann, which had gardening tips, but also, you know, buy Irish goods, you know, advocating that sense of identity. We are a separate identity. And you have men who would be the future volunteers reading a newspaper written by women. So you have that influence going. And education is key to this. It is so important to this. So with those opportunities, people begin to see, yes, this is not the box I'd have to stay in, no matter what my background is. And then once it starts to snowball, certainly after 1912, with the formation of the volunteers and the citizen army is the crucial one for men and women in Dublin inner city, because you're seeing the idea of socialism, equality, real equality for men and women in that organisation. But Inina na Héireann is crucial to showing women, you can do this. We can actually achieve something here. And the big difference is the women from the very start make a difference on the ground. They don't make a difference on paper. It's not like they write down their ideas and say, oh, well, we want to achieve this. We want to achieve this. From day one, the women are saying, okay, there's a problem with kids in this city. They're starving. Let's do something about it. And they set up a program where kids pay a penny for their meal. And over 100 years later, the penny dinners is still going strong, doing that job that those women, young women, women from middle-class backgrounds, women from working-class backgrounds, they get that experience. And the big thing is that women, because we're women, at that time were excluded from so much because of their gender. So they didn't have a voice, and they can actually sort of understand and they can reach out for those who do not have a voice at this particular stage, which is children and the poor, and they use their position to fight for them. And the women never lose that. Never, ever, ever lose that.
Right. So you mentioned 1912, and my second question was because the previous question was an additional one. So my second question was about the around 1916, which is, you know, the era in which you were very much interested. That perhaps there were female organizations which supported the uprising and then participated in the War of Independence. We know a little bit about that, or you might find out a little bit about that if you read the book about Kevin Barry, for example, and the women around Kevin Barry. But perhaps, you know, since you wrote about women and around the Civil War at times, so perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that, about both organizations and perhaps particular women who participated in the uprising, except for, of course, the ones that we well know and recognize from Yeats's poem.
Oh, Lillian, there's so many. And I suppose what we've been looking at, what the decade of centenaries has done for us here in Ireland, is we've been able to discover the women and the role that they played. And so many of them, like you know, if we looked back to our history books, there was only one woman that took part in the revolution, and it was the Countess. That was it. One woman, that was it. But with the release of pension files, we are discovering so many more. Now, we would have known women like Kathleen Clark and so on, but you, in any country, when there's a revolution, you need your big names, but you cannot have anything without that strata of ordinary rank and file men and women. But what we've also discovered is that while you have your active participants, so those members of Cumann na mBan, in 1916, the members of the Irish Citizen Army, because that was its own entity, and then you find after 1916, a lot of women move over to Cumann na mBan and join that body. But there's a whole area, there's a whole group of people we're missing here, and they are the women who were the mothers, the women who were the girlfriends, the women who were the neighbours of these volunteers, who supported, who hid, who let them know there's a raid coming, who passed on information, who were not part of any organisation. And their names are not there. But we're starting to discover those people and that support from the women, because one example I'll give you, and I'm sure Joyce mentions it, you've all probably heard of it, the Monto. So it was the biggest red light district in Europe, all the Madams, because we had so many military barracks here with the British. So, you know, there's unfortunately, where there's soldiers, there's prostitutes. But in the north inner city was the biggest red light district in Europe. And you have the Madams who know the British soldiers, and they were passing on, the girls, their working girls, were passing on information to the IRA from their clients, as in a soldier would go and visit one of the houses, and those women were passing on that information. But we don't know. Those women aren't in books, but we're getting the stories from the folklore, from the oral history, which again is so crucial in telling history. History is not just discovered on documents. The oral testimonies, the folklore, the memories are so important. And that's where you get those women, what they did. And again, the postmistress in the local post office that was, you know, sending on, reading the post off, or the post and the mail that was coming from Dublin Castle being sent down to Kerry. And they could find informers or, you know, information, and they're passing it on. There is one woman, and her name was Lily Mearnan. Now, she is known, she is documented, she was actually very involved, but she's not coming on. She was an intelligence operative for Collins, and she was in Dublin Castle. She is right buy the information. And she provided the names and addresses of the British officers that were then assassinated on the morning of Bloody Sunday. Now, what we're also discovering is, how did this affect those women? How did what they do affect them? And in the case of Lily Mernon, she had a mental breakdown, because did she know what she was doing would actually lead to the deaths of so many people who had wives, who had children, and so on. And you have that sort of ripple effect. And there's so many stories of women we will never, ever know. So you don't just have your activists. You don't just have your big names. You have your members of Cumann na mBan. You have that support there who are actively signing up and doing all that they have to do. But then you have the ordinary women who protected a volunteer, who gave that nod to a volunteer, there's a raid coming, who helped in whatever way they could. But then they're not recognised. But they throw in their lot, and without them, we couldn't have achieved what we did achieve at that time. And then they're the big losers. They're the big losers when we get independence. Sorry, just jumping ahead.
No, you made me, because, I wanted to ask you, and you kind of made me already rethink my views on the prostitutes in Ulysses, because of course, the fact that the book has a lot of sexual content was one reason why it was a forbidden text, but also because it was so shocking to, even around 100 years after the forbidden Victorian knowledge, but still, it was a shocking text to find out that he's writing quite openly about prostitutes and about the brothel. And so, the makeup of Ulysses, the social makeup is quite varied, because we have Molly, who is middle class, and Bloom, middle class again. And then we go lower to the lower strata of the society. So what do you think about Joyce's depiction of these, red light districts and in Dublin? Is it how true and faithful that would be?
Well, it would be faithful, because he was seeing it. He was living amongst it. Like, everyone knew. And the Monto wasn't the only red light district. It was just happened to be the biggest. So this was part of everyday life. And you have it on both sides of Dublin city, so it wasn't like you didn't really have to go far to sort of get inspiration for what he was going to write about. And the thing is, this is a world where all classes of society mix. It's sort of seen as, oh God, it's the working class people. Oh, it's those savages. It's like, but actually, who is funding? Who is actually making this happen? It's the politicians that are building their army barracks, that are then sending the soldiers to oppress a country, and they need their soldiers to be looked after. And because it doesn't look nice, then who are you going to blame? It's sort of like what happens after independence, like with the women and their role. And it's fulfilling a need at the time. But then when it's still in the public eye and it doesn't fit into this new vision that they have, we have to get rid of this. So then all of a sudden it becomes unacceptable. And it's like, how many of those politicians, you find that men that were, in the Free State Army, they were going to the Monto and so on. And it's like, what parallel universe are you living in where it's okay for you to do it, but not for the people? And by the way, this is their world. This is being created for them, because unfortunately opportunities, yous have put them in this box and you're not giving them the opportunity. And it's people being forced to look after each other. And that's a big thing that happens. Like, these women that are seen to be the dregs of society and immoral and so on. Yeah, it was okay to use those immoral women to do what was needed. It was okay to ask members of Cumann na mBan to go and pretend, you're interested in a soldier, drink in a pub by herself. In a Catholic country, a girl in a pub by herself, immediately she's a prostitute. even though she wasn't. So you have all of this being attached to it because it's the feeling you need. But then, as I said, when it's over and when these people say, well, you know, look, I fulfilled a function, maybe can I sort of, you know, progress a little bit? Oh, no, we don't like that anymore. You're not fitting into this new image. So who are the first losers in this case? And as in independence, it's women. And with Joyce's thing, what you've shown is the parallels between the upper echelons and the lower echelons. And it's like, keep those working class savages in their place. Don't dare let them dream. Don't dare let them aspire to something. But they're the people that will look after each other, continue to look after each other. And that's where you find a real sense of community, because no one else will, you know.
Yes, you've mentioned that what happened with the women when the independence came. Your book, The Women of the Irish Revolution, we travel, we trace those different fascinating women, and we see the activity from the time, you know, their revolutionary activity and then till the independence. And most of them, I think, believed in the words from Proclamation of 1916 of equal rights and equal opportunities. And what happened next?
It's so sad to see, because that hope, like those words in 1916 when Pearse reads them out from the GPO, and it's like Irish men and Irish women. And I think there's only another document in the world that sort of has that. But this is a message that the new Ireland, the new republic, when it comes, is going to be so different. Now, the women really believed in that, because sort of just going back to like, if you look at Anina and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and the suffragettes, they're fighting for real change, as in votes for women. Anina are fighting for women to be part of an independent Ireland, but have a very clear vision of that republic. And I've said it time and time again, it's not to take away from the men. The men were fighting for a republic. Now, on paper, with the proclamation, that is the idea, but it seems to have just been an idea, because when they get independence, they're like, so what do we do with it? And it's like, all that really changes is the accents, because those who are in those upper classes remain, and the Irish accents emerge. It's not British accents that are here now, it's Irish accents, but the class, don't attempt to you know, fulfill the idea of the proclamation. Whereas the women, when they see that, it's like, here it is written in black and white what we have been fighting for. And it's like it's verbalized what they've been fighting for. And the women, they coming on, like, adopt that whole policy. And if you look at when the treaty is signed that does not give the republic, the women always go back to the proclamation. That is what they are fighting for, that republic that was proclaimed, that guaranteed equality to man, woman, and very importantly, child. Equal opportunities for, you know, no one would be distinct by their religion. It is a socialist republic, and obviously you've got Connolly to thank for that. And it is not realised. When we guessed the independence for the 26 counties, it is not realised. Now, there's one aspect, or I suppose there's one positive that comes out of the signing of the treaty, in that we had to have a constitution. So we had to write up a new constitution. Now, women over the age of 30 had gotten the vote in 1918 in England and in Ireland. Obviously, women of a certain class, and if you had property and so on. But women over the age of 21 were given the right to vote under our constitution. So suffrage was given to all. Now, that is a huge, huge thing. So you could even imagine the anti-treaty women saying, okay, the republic, right, we need to focus on that, but at least we'll get the vote. And when there is an election, we can then use our power, our right to vote, to basically put down the treaty, you know, oppose it. Women under the age of 30 were not given the right to vote in the 1922 election. So we had to have an election on the treaty. And they did not give the right of those women who now had that right, they were not allowed to vote in that election. And whether it would have changed things, we don't know. But if you think of the age profile of a lot of coming on women, they were young women who would have more than likely voted to oppose the treaty. It's a what if, but you have all of these arguments going on between the politicians, the pro-treaty and anti-treaty politicians, and Sean T. O'Kelly, anti-treaty, is saying to Griffith, okay, put the women on the register, let them vote, get it done. And Griffith is saying, oh, well, I trust the women of Ireland. And he's there, it will take too much time to update the register. And Sean T. O'Kelly is saying, well, back in the war ended in November 1918, there was an election in December. They could update the register then, you know. What you're saying is you don't trust the women of Ireland. And Griffith is like, I do. And then Cumann on were the first group to hold a convention on whether to vote to accept or reject the treaty, and they overwhelmingly rejected it. And Sean T says this to Griffith, saying, well, the women have spoken and they've rejected your treaty, and that is not the women of Ireland behind you. So you had that fear. But then, and what sort of reinforces this idea, is that once the Civil War was well and truly underway, we had an election in 1923. So a year after, and the women under 30, over the age of 21, were allowed to vote in that election. So it's like, what? But then, although they have the right to vote, then their civil rights, they begin to chip away at their civil rights, because the women won't fit into this nice little box. The idea of what a woman or an Irish woman should be. She is not a rebel. A proper Irish woman should not know how to hold a gun, and should be a mother, a nurturer, and so on. And you see this chipping away at women's rights. So you can have your vote, but really, it means nothing. And then that just begins in 1924, and then it culminates in 1937 with our constitution, where it's written there in black and white, basically, that through economic necessity, a woman should not have to leave her duties, as a mother, basically putting women back in the home. And then it just goes on and on and on and on and on from there. So what the women believe in that proclamation is not realized.
Yeah, but many anti-treaty women, they were extremely disappointed with what happened in the constitution from 1937, and they rejected it. Oh, even you are writing about this in your book, like giving an examples of many of them.
Yeah, and you have Justina. So we talk about our Civil War in that it's a war of brothers, that it's brother against brother, but women were, wives were against their husbands, sisters were against each other, best friends were against each other. Like there was two in particular that were going to kill each other, and you have like 500 women plus imprisoned, for their activities, anti-treaty activities at this time. But while you have that sort of the split within the women, there are then times when the women come back, and it is things like the 1937 Constitution. It begins with like the Juries Act. So Kevin O'Higgins, who was the Minister for Home Affairs in 1924, he tries to introduce legislation where women will not sit on juries. Now, the whole thing of a court case is you're meant to be, given the opportunity in front of your peers. But if you're a woman and your jury is full of men, how is that a fair trial? Because men, and at that time, men had a very, it was not good, for women, because again, prostitutes and unwanted pregnancies and all of this. So it's very judgmental. How are you going to get a fair hearing? So you find that the women put aside their differences to come back together, unite, and try and fight it. And they defeat that. They actually stop Kevin O'Higgins doing that in 24, but then he won't let it drop. And he comes back to it a few years later where, well, if women want to sit on a jury, they can opt in, they can ask to sit on a jury. Now, that's it's putting barriers up already. But then we have the Conditions of Employment Bill. Now, everyone, the Countess Markievicz is great. Kathleen Clark, if you have not read her book, please read her book. She is amazing. She is Tom Clark's widow. She goes from 1916 all the way through, but she is a very outspoken woman. She's a senator, so she becomes a senator in the 30s. And online, if you go onto the Oireachtas website, you can see all the Dáil debates from the Treaty and the women saying what their arguments are, but also the debates in the Senate. And the Conditions of Employment Bill was basically an attempt to get women out of the workforce, because women were seen to be taking the jobs of men. And it was all this skilled labor and so on, because women were making inroads. And Kathleen Clark stands up. So she was anti-treaty, but again, she would join forces with Jenny Wise Power, who had been pro-treaty, because they say, look, we're united, we've got power together. Park the differences from the Civil War, and because women are going to lose out here. And Kathleen Clark stands up and she asks the male minister, she says, can the minister please specify what jobs exactly the women are taking from the men? Is it the scrubbing of floors? Is it the menial jobs? Is it this and this? Because if it is those jobs, let the men have them. And he wouldn't answer her. And then it was all about, women being in the home and being nurturers. And she's there going, I have no problem with a man raising children if they would do it as well as a woman. Like oh my God, she attacks them at every opportunity. So they join forces. They don't succeed with the Conditions of Employment Bill. It is brought in, so you can see that chipping away. And then finally, 1937, they're all united. They're trying to say, do not do this. Please do not do this. And just who they're up against with the church and the politicians, and we're so conservative. But you find that with countries that have gone through a revolution, you find after the Second World War, it becomes very conservative. And of course, who are then the losers are the women. Who they're up against is too strong. And despite their best efforts, they cannot stop the Constitution. And women in that, and it is still in our Constitution, it is still there. There's meant to be a committee that lasts, I don't know how long, thinking about rewarding it. No, you don't need a committee to just get rid of this. There's no need to reward it. Get rid of it.
But I think you need to get a referendum to make changes in the Constitution, isn't it? Yeah.
That's it. And they're having a committee to decide on a referendum, and everyone wants a referendum. So it makes you think, going, are there still elements, which obviously there are, as we all know, there is still a lot of patriarchy around. But in this day and age, when we have, women have to go out and work, you have to have two parents working to raise the money to pay the creche fees to raise your child. Yeah. So it's because the government, will not step in to provide affordable housing. So, everything that is sort of there in the proclamation has not been realized. It's
we have the reaction for this, Diana, I notice we have all this reaction in the Irish literature right now, Irish women literature, this fight of class, this kind of like reacting after those years of basically closing women at home, because that was basically looked like. Liliana, you have a question going back to Nora and classes, actually. So.
Yes, because of course I'm fascinated with the story of Nora and Joyce, and so my two questions were speculative. The first one was that in Dubliners in Eveline, the main character decides not to leave with her prospective husband, her lover, and of course in reality Nora leaves Dublin with Joyce, and they're not married. Now, what would happen, say, that the relationship is not really, well, it wasn't working, but it's okay, it's not working on
it's working worse than it was working.
Yes, it's not working worse than it wasn't working, and Nora decides to go back home. What would, how would she be treated by her family, by her friends? What would happen? How much of a stigma that could have been at the beginning of the 20th century?
Oh, it was a thing that, like, it wasn't really a choice for women. it wasn't a choice for women. You just had to, and I think that is sort of across the board, across Europe. Like now, we did have divorce. We actually had divorce. It's awful to say that we actually, as women, had more rights under British rule than we did under our own. Like divorce, there was access to abortions, but it wasn't illegal. But if like divorce, that was only open to women of the upper classes, you know, an ordinary, you know, working class woman raising our kids, you know, it wasn't really an option. And later on, certainly in the 30s and 40s and so on, it seemed to become even harder for a woman, because at least sort of in the early days, a woman still had her identity. But as we go on from the 30s and so on, like a woman couldn't have a library card. A woman could not have, you know, if she wanted to rent, because we all rented TVs, you know, nobody was rich enough to buy a television. But that was all done under her husband's name. You actually were the property of your husband, you know. But there are instances now where, and I've met people whose mothers were in Cumann na mBan, fathers were volunteers, and you find with a lot of the men, like again after war, they turned to alcohol, and the man that they married in 1920 or 21 was not actually the man they end up being married to, because of the post-traumatic stress and stuff, and their way to deal with it is through alcohol. Some women walked away, and their community supports them, and that's the thing that you find with the working class communities, and you find it in Dublin, that they will look after their own. They will take in those women, if they make that decision to leave. Now, officially, the church might come after them, you know, because they're, you know, what you're doing this, you know, this is not the way it goes, and the best thing for a child is to be, you know, in that unit. No, it's not. But you'd find a community would step in, and there'd be no stigma really there. But from the top down, yes, and these women would be labeled, you know, as whatever, you know, they're failures, they're this, they're that, their kids are this, their kids are that. So yeah, there's a very different opinion coming from the different, and certainly from the establishment. Definitely there would have been a difference of opinion. But as I said, I've talked to people in the inner city, and who lived in the inner city, and some women were brave enough to walk away, and their community supports them, their family supported them, and when the institutions came looking for their kids, the community hid them, and so on. So you do have that, thankfully, that aspect of support from the ground up.
Yeah.
So you think that if Nora returned home, then she would be reclaimed by her family and probably helped rather than ostracized?
Probably if their middle class might be a little bit different, because it depends on their social standing as well. But then also it's like, well, what way can you portray the story? If it's bad enough, then they can sort of turn it around. Like one example I'll give you now, and she was from a fairly middle class family, there was a girl called Josie Stallard, and she was from Kilkenny, came from a big Republican family, but a middle class family. Like her father was he was on the corporation. I think her father may have been the mayor or something, right? So they worked their way up, and she fell in love with a volunteer. Now, the family loved her husband, but this man had been wounded. They're in the book, but he was wounded, and Josie fell in love with him, and her father died. She needs to be a doctor while she's, you know, fighting this revolution. And her family said, don't attempt to marry him. Like, if you do, we're going to cut you off. And the thing was, they said, if you're going to marry him, you have to ask us permission. So he organized the wedding. He proposed to her. They got married while he was in prison, and she wrote to her mother on the Friday. I think they got married on the Saturday, knowing that the post would get there on Monday. So technically she had asked her family, but they got married. But her family cut her off. Now, the thing is, she's involved with him in the Civil War, like they're anti-treaty, they're fighting together. She was pregnant. He ends up getting arrested, or he leaves and he's continuing the fight. And she's like, what am I going to do? So she went back to her family, not knowing if her family would take her back.
Mhm.
Thankfully they did, and she had her baby there and so on. But they were adamant that she would not marry him. And it was the same with Kathleen Clark and Tom. Like Tom Clark was in prison with Kathleen's uncle. He adored him, but he didn't want him to be the husband of his niece. You know, so you do have those tensions as well within families. So yeah, but there were women brave enough to walk away.
It's actually quite an interesting, I don't know if you know the story with Nora's mother, because her father was a baker in Galway and he had the problem with alcohol. And at some stage, Nora's mom said, that's it. And she kicked him out. And she got a separation, actually official separation. She got some money for, raising the kids from government. It was, the British times. So she was brave enough to secure some money for her children, and she was not willing to accept that anymore. And then we have, because their mothers, like Nora mother, and then Joyce mother, which was basically, we can say, killed by his father, like so many pregnancies and physical abuse and alcohol and etc. So one was brave, the other maybe not brave enough to do so, but unmarried Nora with 2 children back in Galway.
Yes, back in Galway.
Yeah, when she was traveling to Galway with the children, she was putting a wedding ring on her finger because, like, her mom and uncles, they did not know that they are not married. So,
and I suppose another example is Maud Gonne, because she had an affair with a French Frenchman and had his children, and then marries John McBride and has her son Jean McBride. But she left him, like she left. But you've got then that reaction from the church, because so they weren't. I think she tried for divorce, and there was a lot of support for McBride, for John McBride, against this, because W.B. Yeats obviously comes in on the side of Maud Gonne, is a smear campaign and so on. But the church would have totally spoken out about this. But she was one that went, oh, I'm not having this. But then she uses, like, I suppose it worked for her that he was shot in 1916, and then she becomes the widow, but then that serves her purpose. It's another platform for Maud Gonne to continue her work, and it was amazing work that she did. But she would be one that certain aspects of society would go fair play, but then the establishment and so on would go, oh, she's a harlot, she's this, she's that, fallen woman or whatever, how dare she,
Liana, I know you have another question related to Nora.
Yes, I'm still puzzled by the representation of by what Joyce would have written and what he didn't write in Ulysses. But I am puzzled by the question of there were different social class, and so the question is whether, as such, would Nora be ostracized back in Ireland, even if they came back as married? How would the kind of interchange or the disparate social classes, how would that work? Would you marry within your own class? And then what would happen? You mentioned, the families who didn't agree with the young women marrying somebody they didn't like. So what would happen if it wasn't a revolutionary who was in prison for the revolutionary activities, but it was somebody who was actually simply, of a different social standing? So
I suppose it really does depend on the person and their standing in society and how much they actually loved their daughters, because this generation as well, if we think of that, like the 1890s, that generation, 1880s, 1890s, like they're actually marrying for love. They're not marrying for, you know, the whole sort of property. Now with the upper classes, it is those, you know, the landed gentry and, you know, keeping that, you know, the wealth within the families and becoming more powerful. But you look at Countess Markievicz with you know, Casimir, because again, I suppose it ties back certainly with the likes of Countess and so on, like they're going to art school, they're training, they're studying in England. And so you've got this world being opened up to them. And especially with art, because that was seen as an acceptable practice for women, you know, to a safe thing to study. But they're being new ideas and thought processes are being revealed to them. But you've got then people who are artists, you know, that are mixing in those circles, people like, you know, writers like Joyce and other artists that are not from the posh part. So you can imagine, you know, yourself, like, you know, when you're, you know, a young woman and you see like an artist and you go, oh my God, you know, and especially if they're like, you know, the other size of the tracks, that makes them more attractive, you know. So you have that aspect of it as well. And in some cases, obviously their families would have cut them off and, you know, look, fend for yourself. But I suppose it's you know, it's not a question I can answer definitively, because in terms of the revolution, there were aspects of that. There were people from wealthier backgrounds that married guys who were not from wealthy backgrounds. The family did cut them off, but the families then didn't cut them off, you know. So it's not a definitive answer that I can give you. But certainly if you look at then, say, like, you know, O'Casey and the way Joyce writes and what Joyce writes, is it more so to do with that and how that's accepted amongst that aspect, that you know, the social stratosphere of like, oh my God, and she's married to him? No. So because you've got everyone attacking Joyce and all of these people who are shown in a way the realities of the situation. Like you look at O'Casey, you know, and he was telling it as it was from the perspective, because he lived it, like Joyce lived it. And it was, you know, the Irelands, they were shown through their words the reality of the situation for their people, from their perspective as well, you know. And of course we don't like anything, but certainly, you know, the those in the powers that be, they don't like things to be upset. You know, so a ruffian coming in to the family as well, that would be, oh my God, no. So I'd say there were a lot that turned their backs on their daughters, but I would say there were those that realized this is their choice. We have to support her and let them know that we're here. You would hope.
Yeah, but kind of a comment to that, and I'm sure Justina recognizes the novel, Joseph O'Connor's Star of the Sea, where you know, it's of course it's 1849, I think the action is, and the guy marries a couple of years before he marries. He's a landlord in Ireland, and he marries a woman who is from a wealthy but middle class background, and of course his father cuts him off, because he was supposed to marry the daughter of a neighbor, a landlord, and they would, you know, work together, borrow money and stuff. And of course, there was a whole big story about that. So, but that's a generation or 100 years, almost 100 years earlier. So that's a little bit different story. And of course, taking care of money, Lady Gregory marries Lord Gregory because it's convenient, and she thought that she would have never married, and then has an affair with Wilfred Scanlon Blunt, but that's a different story altogether. However, my second comment would be also connected with literature, and also with what you said, that the women looked at the proclamation and that nothing happened because they were the rights were taken rather than given, and so on and so forth. And it kind of made me think that each new country after a revolution, after regaining independence, kind of wants to create a utopia, wants to create, the Pakistan. Pakistan means the land of the pure. Land of the pure means that you are morally pure, you want to create an ideal social structure. We went through that. We went through the same thing in 1819, basically. We wanted exactly the same thing. Well, 5 years on and it didn't happen. 50 years on and it still didn't happen. And we can go on and on. But this idea that you create a country that is in some ways so different from your horrible neighbor, and it will be an example to the world. And of course, that then turns on its own people, because you can't create, this has been done by Respublika Christiana, this has been done in the Middle Ages when Rome was trying to recreate the great Roman Empire based on the new religion. And once again, then, the empire turns on itself and it turns into dystopia out of that great idea of creating this ideal country for everyone. But then, some people are more equal than others, and the story goes on. But nevertheless, it's in these already in the literature of the 40s and later. Mervyn Wall and Aymar O'Duffy, they already laugh at that. That kind of not really keeping the promises, the kind of utopian ideas of creation of a country that could never ever be its own ideal, because people are just people and they want different things, and things are, you have to negotiate more than just give things to do and things to believe. You have to negotiate and you have to try to understand different standings. But that, of course, was not the idea of those in power. Those in power wanted to make sure that you have this great goal in mind. So perhaps that's also the case with what Joyce was seeing. And of course, at the end of Mervyn Wall's The Unfortunate Fursey is this one sentence, which is that all good writers will have to go in exile, because that's the way of looking at Ireland. That's the only way of looking at Ireland from a perspective. And that's exactly what happens to Joyce. And I think one of the greatest, the most interesting aspects of the novel, and really something that is lasting, is that he gives us food for thought all the time. Still, that we reread it and look, oh, well, okay, let's check that. Let's see how it was. But I think he was really a visionary in mentioning the prostitutes that, you now told us were such an important part of that society, a entirely forgotten element of that society, that he mentions different social classes, that he mentions different political views, that he's not afraid to voice them, even, so that people won't agree with him, but still they are there. And also this kind of really kaleidoscopic makeup of different female characters, I find absolutely fascinating. And of course, the ending, the fragment for today, which was Molly's monologue, is still something that we reread and rediscover every time we reread. And even more so because in the new translation, the last sentence, this last expression is a little bit differently translated than before, and it gives this new translation, and this is, I think, that's something that we should look at. This new translation gives us a little bit different view on Molly, gives her more power and more self-development and more autonomy as a character. And I find that also fascinating, that after so many years with the new translation, the translator thought that it would be interesting to look at Molly as this character who has something to say and says, yes, I will, but it's in the Polish translation, it's even more forceful than that. Okay, and these were my two comments to the literature and the women in Joyce and around Joyce's times. Justina, back to you.
I think the last question, but we've discussed, I think, all those topics that we have in the separate questions all together in different one. But coming back to Nora and education, which you mentioned at the beginning, you know, for Nora, education is finished when she was 12. Like that's it. That's all she can do. Her family is poor. They are not able to support her and paying for other education. She just doesn't have a choice. She needs to go to work, and that's it, right? But depending on the background, like what choices women have back then, you know, what can they do? I don't know, in relation to work, education, or if we use like a modern, more professional career. So what were the options? Studying art, you mentioned already.
art was a big thing. But again, that would be from sort of the wealthier backgrounds. And, you know, it was acceptable. That was the acceptable course that women could go. And, you know, God forbid if a woman wants to go and study, you know, like science or something at that stage, although there were a few. But generally art is the main thing that women, culture, you know, and so on. But in terms of opportunities for working class, poorer people, there were very few opportunities for men. So for women, they were pretty non-existent. So like Nora, once you hit 12, you went to work. And for girls, it was into domestic service or into factory work. Some were shopkeeper, you know, shop girls and so on. But as then the sort of the opening decades of the 20th century, those whose fathers would be a little bit like the managers or the foremen in companies, they're the ones then that would sort of try and get their daughters into a trade. So in my area, in the Liberties, weaving, dressmaking, because that had been going back. It was a trade from the Huguenots. So it is a hub of that. So you find a lot of women go into that industry. And they are like, you know, the top of their game in some circumstances, but they're working in the dress factories and so on. Kathleen Clark, you know, again, a little bit higher up, like her uncle set up a bakery. She refused to work for him, but her mother had been a seamstress, so she trained Kathleen. Kathleen set up her own business. Then when she got married, she was a very astute businesswoman. So with a little bit of money that she'd been given, they were able to set up an ice cream parlor in New York. But when they came back to Ireland, they set up a newsagent. So the other thing is, though, certainly with the Gaelic League, those classes, the Irish speaking classes, that opens up personal education to people. You find a lot of women going into secretarial school and then primary school teachers. And then, of course, the other one, nuns. So you'd have, like, if you had a big family, a son went into the police, a son became a priest, and if you had a daughter, she became a nun. And that was generally in the country. That would, because big families, one farm and so on, and one son gets left the farm and the daughter gets nothing, so she's married off, or else she becomes a nun. So that would be an option as well. But that I can't sort of overstate the importance of that cultural revolution, because it gave people, it showed people that you can educate yourself, and if you get that confidence in yourself, you can go on and do things. Like, you've got Moira Comerford, who was a secretary. Now, she came from a sort of wealthy-ish family who fell on hard times. She was sent to secretary school in England and becomes aware of sort of politics, Irish politics over there, comes back to Ireland, is in Dublin in 1916, goes to Countess Markievicz and says, let me help. And Markievicz says, no, you just spread the word, go back to where you're from, Wexford and so on. But then she became a secretary for Alice Stopford Green. And although she's from this particular, you know, part of society, who she is meeting through her work It is all these higher ups. It is all these well-to-do people. And she's listening to the conversations. Maura Comfort then became one of the main writers for the Irish press. So a lot of women then who become involved in the revolution have skills and so on that they learned, because women had to count money, they had to collect money, they were distributing the funds, they go into secretarial work and so on. So through their revolutionary activities, a lot of them also find work as well. But certainly at the turn of the century, there wasn't many opportunities for young girls. Hence, in Nina Naher and see that, Maud Gonne sees that, and she sets up the schools in the North Inner City to give those children a chance. And they then get educated and they then become the future teachers or so on. And Margaret Skinner, who was a revolutionary, a primary school teacher, and very stern, but God knows how many kids she inspired to become teachers. And it would have been poor kids that she was dealing with. She herself didn't come from a great background. So, some of them were able to break out of that, of the place society had put on them. They were able to rise above that. And you still see that today, Justina. I still see that in my area because I come from what is called a disadvantaged area. So don't dare attempt to, dream that you can be this or that. And, when you're a woman. But it's like, no, I think with this and, and my God, like Cassie would be the same, who Justina. Like you still sort of have that attitude of this is your class. Don't try and break above it, And there's a few that go, oh, not a hope. I'm going to smash through it. So, and you take inspiration from those who went before you.
And last question, I think. The name of this lady was mentioned a few times already, but your favorite heroine and why is it Kathleen Clark?
No, she's just brilliant. Oh my God, like if any of you have studied 1916, I'm sure you've heard the song Grace. And that is the love story of 1916. Joseph Plunkett, Marion Grace, hours before his execution, and they're young. They're the romantic idea, and he sacrificed himself for Ireland. But Tom and Kathleen, oh my God, if you want to sort of know what it was like to be married to a man who loves you but loves his country even more, this is Kathleen's story. And like they had kids, like she's so blunt in her memoir, right? And like Tom Clark is my hero, so I sort of got to know Kathleen through reading about Tom. And she didn't publish her memoir when she was alive. Her niece published it. Now she gives out about everyone. Like if the great thing about Kathleen Clark is if she saw something was wrong, she was in a position to speak for people who did not have that voice. And what I said earlier, the women never lose that. The women always speak up where they can because they as women themselves had sort of endured that. So she watches her husband, prepare for the rising. He goes out and she's, said goodbye to him. He said he wouldn't surrender. He'd die in the fight. He doesn't die in the fight, and then she manages to get to see him one last time in Kilmainham jail. And you think if that was you or me, you'd be like, oh my God, I'm seeing him again. And she goes to Kilmainham jail and gives out to him. She has an argument with Tom saying, you told me you weren't going to surrender. And he's going, they made me surrender because she had prepared herself. Then she is the one that keeps the movement together. She is the one that gets Michael Collins in the position of finance and sort of sets him on that road. She's imprisoned, is worried about her 3 kids. She becomes a Republican judge in the War of Independence. She becomes a member of the Dáil. She's elected to the Dáil. She's anti-treaty in the Civil War. Then she becomes a senator and she speaks out against the Conditions of Employment Bill. And then she becomes the first woman in Ireland to be a Lord Mayor. So that being obviously a male-dominated thing. So in 1939, she is the Lord Mayor of Dublin. First thing she does is take down all the portraits of the royals in the Mansion House. The Lord Mayor's chain was given to us by King Billy, King William of Orange. She would not wear it. because that is our oppressor. And how could she, as a Fenian, you know, Republican, wear that? So they had to make her a special chain. And Crean Ní Dálaigh, she was Lord Mayor in 2016, and that was the chain. She wore Kathleen Clark's chain when she was Lord Mayor. And even De Valera, who she supported, oh my God, because his whole thing was when he'd get into power, he would get the 6 counties back. And she keeps on at him, going, when are you going to move on the north? When are you going to get those 6 counties back? And she's speaking in newspapers and everything. She's amazing. She is just, but her book, Revolutionary Woman, read it and read it about 10 times. I've read it about 10 times. It is just, it's a real love story. And she knew that, like, Gordon Tom had a life in America and he wants to come back to Ireland because he knew things were changing. And she didn't want to come back with him, but she couldn't keep him in America because he would be miserable. But she knew if they came back, Ireland was going to take her husband. She would not live with him. They would not spend their late years together. And that's exactly what happened. But, she's amazing. I love her. I do.
You can explore some of the women in Liz books, so highly recommended. Now it's time for the questions from the public. So if you have any, please send your questions by chat. Okay, Liz, you probably see the question, but I can read it out. Okay, just a question from Karina Winsławska. When Nora gets pregnant, she knows little about pregnancy, delivery, and the child's upbringing. When she's going through a miscarriage, it is James who diagnoses what is happening to her at the moment. Are these scenes portraying the lack of knowledge among young Irish women at the beginning of the 20th century, or was it more because Nora was fostered by her grandmother, who probably had not passed the knowledge about such matters to her? Yeah, I think this is probably one of the saddest thing in the book, in the Nora book. I felt so much her loneliness at such situations. Let's lack information definitely about that. What do you think? What was the knowledge of women at this time?
Well, like again, see, midwifery wasn't really there was only a certain few, like that would have been a new sort of training. Like 1826 was when we got our first maternity hospital, certainly on the south side of Dublin City. And the reason that was set up was the Coombe Hospital. The reason that was set up was because you had the Rotunda on the north side, which was the only hospital as far as I know, and 2 women from my area were trying to get across to give birth to on the north side of the city and died. And there was this realization that, oh my God, there's a lot of women dying in childbirth and so on. And so the Coombe Hospital was set up then in 1826. But in terms of that lack of knowledge, like, I don't know if any of you have seen Call the Midwife, which is a brilliant, brilliant program. It's on BBC. But that whole study of in society, and it's very similar to what it was like in Ireland. There was a lot of sort of folklore passed down. There wasn't the necessary, what we know today, like what is how it all happens and so on. But the real tragedy is that you had a case like that in the 1980s, as in a girl and her baby died. And, there was that whole stigma attached to, unwanted pregnancy. So you do have a lot of girls, that don't know what's happening to them. Like even in when I was in school, so in the 1990s, there was cases of young girls that didn't know, like 14, 15, and didn't know what was happening. So it's not of just Nora's generation. That translated right down to the early years of, the 21st century. There is that, that formal training, that formal education. Your education stops at 12, and you're not told the whole ins and outs of it. And also there's this whole thing of, I don't know if it's the same in Poland, but the mothers talk to the daughters about that type of thing. That's not a conversation that's had with men and boys and so on. Thankfully, that has changed now. But tragically, what you see happening with Nora was happening in Ireland up until recently, and possibly still is happening. So again, it's that education, talking, and mothers, you know, being able to deal with it because the facilities weren't there, or depending on if it was known who was the father, depending on who the father was, how young was the girl, that would be another thing. And in Ireland, I don't know how many of us are aware of this, like, you know, there's so many families that a girl had a child, but then the grandparents raised the baby as their own, and then the mother is actually, the child believes the mother is the sister. Like, that was, so yeah, there's a whole lack of education at that time, but that continued right down. It wasn't just, you know, relevant to the 1910s, 1920s. Kathleen Clark, she suffered a miscarriage. Quite a number of women actually who were active suffered a miscarriage. She doesn't actually mention those words, but she knew what was happening, and you know, was able to seek help. But you know, having access to doctors, those basic rights, a lot of people would not have that chance. So you turn to your local community, and a lot of the women, certainly in inner city Dublin as well, with so many prostitutes, they would know what was happening, and they would be sort of who would be turned to, you know, to help in that situation. A bit like Call the Midwife. You see it in quite a lot in Call the Midwife, where the neighbours deliver the children. It's not a doctor or a midwife, and no one will come and help.
Well, that's again an issue that it's that we see in the contemporary Irish literature, you know, written by women, like this rediscovering of the woman's body, like talking about body, talking about sex, and all this issue. You know, there's so much Irish literature translated into Polish language right now, you know, written by a woman. It's like, I haven't seen that in years. So, and the amount of the female literature published in Ireland, you know, you see it yourself. It's like shelves and shelves, probably. Do we have another question? Maybe someone would like to ask Liz a question as well. Might wait for a chat, but if not, there will be a huge thank you from my side and from Liana's side as well.
And a huge thank you from my side as well. I'm going to go on Amazon and buy the Kathleen Clark book now. Yeah, I haven't read it, so. Well,
I have it on my shelf, so in case, just let me know, I can.
Okay.
Her birthday is the 11th of April, and this year is the 50th anniversary of Kathleen's death. She died in 1972, but her birthday is the 11th of April. So light a candle or something for Kathleen.
Yes, we definitely do. And thank you very much, Liz, for your time. And it was very, very interesting again, as always, meeting with you. And the recording of the meeting will be available tomorrow on our YouTube channel. So in case you would like to share it with someone, you will be able to do that. So I think we'll have to say goodbye.
Thanks so much, Justina and Liliana. Thank you, everyone. And it's always a pleasure, Justina. And keep up the fantastic work.
Thank you very much, Liz. You too. Keep inspiring.
Yes, keep us inspired.
Thank you.